Hello, this is Rachel Babin from Oncology News Australia, proud producers of the Oncology podcast. Welcome to the latest episode of the OJC Meets series, sister series of the Oncology Journal Club. In today's episode, Eva Segeloff and Craig Underhill chat with a truly cult figure in the oncology world. Yes, it's Stephen Vogl from New York. Steve and the team discuss ESMO, then delve deeper, sharing some fascinating insights from his long career as a generalist oncologist, the changes to his practice over the years in New York, and some in-depth analysis on trial design. It's a rare opportunity to learn more about this truly cult figure, so we hope you enjoy. For the latest oncology news and podcast updates, get the Oncology newsletter for free on our website. You'll see a link on the top of oncologynews.com.au. This is Rachel Babin, and this is the Oncology Podcast.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Steve Vogl from New York to the Oncology Journal Podcast. Steve.
Hang on. You don't really have Steve Vogl from New York on the podcast, do you? You are just kidding. Give it a try. Pretend you're Steve. Go on, say Vogl, New York.
Vogl, New York.
That's pretty good. What do you think?
That was just you, Craig. Try again.
Vogl, New York.
So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome him on. Steve, thank you.
Next time we're actually in the room at ASCO and they don't allow questions, we're going to start a big chant up through the hall going, Vogl, Vogl, Vogl. Get you up to the mic.
At San Antonio, the audiovisual operators know me, and they like that I stand up to the powers that be. And apparently the session chairmen have a microphone in their ear.
Okay.
And the audiovisual guys can talk to. And one of them told me, he was going to close the session, and we saw you going, so we told him, wait, Vogel's coming.
We're going to cover a number of topics hopefully close to your heart, and where we can talk about pretty much whatever you'd like to talk about today. But the first question, so what do you think the solution is? How are we going to claw back the design by real-world oncologists as opposed to doing pharma studies?
So there are different approaches. You can't outlaw bad trials because that's just something that will go on forever. But you can, in the major societies, refuse to present them. If you have a statistical reviewer who understands what's going on, you won't be allowed to present two arms of a three-arm trial without statistical considerations that admit that something has gone on to exclude the third arm. It existed, and there are more questions that were being asked than they have revealed to us. So if they can't present to ASCO and ESMO, and if the FDA knows that oncology as a group thinks these studies are bunk, the FDA will be under pressure not to approve their drugs, and they'll stop doing this. Because unless the FDA or the European Medications Agency approves the drugs, they have no market. Maybe they can sell it in India, but India has no money to pay these prices.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating area, and I would agree that I think the influence is like a bracket creep, isn't it? A stage migration, and it's something that we just do need to be mindful of. So, Steve, we have a lot of trainees listening. So do you think it's still possible to treat a broad range of cancers, or should we all be subspecialists now?
So it's always possible. It's more work because you have to know more. You have to have some resources to help you. It always helps if you find someone who's really smart to tell him how smart he is, because then when you need his help, he'll answer your emails. But the answer is, yes, it's possible. I don't know if it's possible to treat everything, but it was never possible to treat everything. After 1990, I decided I couldn't possibly treat acute leukemia physically. I couldn't be there often enough. And the facilities I had to work in didn't have the institutionalized resources to back me up when I couldn't be there. I'm not sure any facility has those, but some come closer than the ones I had.
So what tumors do you treat now?
I treat almost everything except acute leukemia. I don't treat children. There are some things I see much less frequently than others. For probably historical reasons, I see relatively little renal and bladder cancer and essentially no testis cancer.
So you work in the Bronx, and so you considered to be a community, what we call a community oncologist, I guess. So for us, that's an interesting concept to be considered part of a community in such a big city. So, for us, New York is, one of the biggest cities in the world. And doesn't everyone just jump on the subway and go across to Memorial Sloan Kettering for treatment? Like, how do you practice as a community oncologist in New York?
So things have changed. But the original model, when I first left academia and went into practice in the early 1980s, pretty much most people with everything were cared for relatively locally, and most of the big centers didn't want to have too many patients. The model was that they would have some professor in his laboratory, because laboratory work was difficult, and taking care of desperately sick people, that was easy. So they could do that during their lunch hour and then go back to their laboratory. The hospital where I worked most of the time for many, many years was built on the idea that, the professors will fill up the hospital in their spare time. Of course, the people who built it, a bunch of academics, had no idea what medicine was really like. And those people had no patients. So they quickly had to open up the hospital to the doctors who were in the area, who would then fill it with patients and take care of them. So the norm in the United States was doctors mostly on their own or in small groups. Having a group of 50 doctors, which happened in the county in which I live, was special and extraordinary. I had we called them attendings. He would come make rounds with us for a month when we were in training, who was in this group. And all he ever really wanted to talk about was group practice because it was so unusual at the time. So as I told Craig in an email, the community is not necessarily the people. It's the group of doctors who know and trust one another, who send their patients back and forth. That has been destroyed, intentionally, I believe.
So what happens now is patients are more referred to the big.
So it's not like that. What happens is the big institutions have gone into the practice of medicine. So what does that mean? That means they have absorbed the doctors who were out there in the community, and they become employees of the big institutions. In Manhattan, it's New York Presbyterian, which has two medical schools, Columbia and Cornell, that are still separate with separate faculties, NYU and Mount Sinai. In the Bronx, it's a hospital called Montefiore, and they have their own doctors, which they're the same, by and large, the same doctors who were there before, but not entirely. Like all big institutions, they prefer young people who will work cheaper than older people who demand more money. And above all, they demand one thing, money. The second thing, money, and the third thing is money. If you don't make them enough money, they cut your salary or they fire you. And that becomes the priority. The computer is the whip and the measure. And if you don't generate enough income via the computer, you're finished. That changes a lot. It changes the patient interaction because the doctors are now looking at the computer, not the patient. It changes the duration of the interaction. No matter how sick a patient is, there's another patient waiting in 6 or 10 minutes. And it changes the referral patterns because the doctor doesn't have time to manage more than one problem at a time. So the patient has to go see 6 doctors instead of one.
Yeah. So again, do you think there needs to be some pushback on that? So it sounds like it's like corporatization of the medical practices.
Oh, absolutely. So the problem is who has the power to push back? So how this happened is really interesting. Why do you think the doctors sold themselves into slavery? What happened is the private insurance companies realized that they need the doctors. So there are some doctors they need more than others. Which ones? A lot of them are. So if you were in a large doctor group, either managed by a businessman or by a hospital-employed businessman, they would pay you 3 times what they would pay a single practitioner. Because if they don't have those 150 or 500 doctors, they can't sell their insurance to big businesses who are where their profits come from. So once there was a differential, which as far as I understand, these are all secret agreements, but I have friends who signed them and they tell me they get paid 3 times as much for the same service if they're part of a large group than when they were single doctors or in a group of 3 gastroenterologists or 5 nephrologists. So a 3-fold increase in payment per service is enough to drive most of them who have college tuition to pay and mortgages to pay into these large groups, even though they're now put under the thumb of an administrator who may know nothing about medicine, or at least have no training. So some of these people aren't dumb. They know how to make money. They went to business school.
Yeah, so there's probably some valid lessons there for us all to learn about the art of medicine versus the business of medicine and being careful what we wish for. What do you think your proudest conference question moment was?
So you alerted me to that question, and I don't know. I can tell you my most embarrassing moments.
Yeah.
The first one I remember was at an ASCO meeting where there was a presentation of 2 different ways of administering a drug. And this was a perfectly done cooperative group study, once a week, every 3 weeks. And what had been done, and I'm not quite sure how the statistician allowed it, is they found a group of patients treated with the old every week way who were 3rd line rather than 1st line chemotherapy and tossed them into the control group, which immediately made the control group do even worse. And they presented this as a positive study. So I wanted to point out that this wasn't appropriate. And I asked if the presenter knew how the patients they added to the control group had done, right? And he said, of course we did. And I said, well, then how can you do it? You're destroying your randomization. So the problem wasn't in what I asked. The problem was that 4,000 people in the audience started to applaud. And this made what was a real question somewhat embarrassing. Eventually, the speaker and I became friends again.
Fantastic. So, Steve, you once famously said, I'm going to quote you here, sometimes you learn more from patients who don't do what you want them to do than from the ones who do what you want. Do you still stand by that? And can you give us some recent instances on what you've learned from your patients who didn't do what you wanted them to do?
So I don't design studies anymore, except in my head. I think the classic example of patients who didn't do what you wanted, who then set a world standard, was a woman who I think was an alcoholic who had hairy cell leukemia. This is in the 1980s, and she was in California. This is when hairy cell leukemia was barely treatable and purine antagonists were new drugs. So they gave her a drug called cladribine, which is a very good drug. Eventually, they thought it cured hairy cell leukemia, and it turned out it didn't, but it was a very good drug nonetheless. So she got 1 week of cladribine. It worked very nicely. They wanted to give her 5 more cycles at monthly intervals. She folded her arms across her chest and said no. And at least over the next few years, her hairy cell leukemia never came back. So the investigator, a Dr. Pirro, said, my God, 1 is enough. And that became the standard for the world and still is. I'm not sure everyone agrees that cladribine alone is the standard, but that's how we give it. 1 week of therapy. When I was very young, I was designing studies for ovarian cancer when cisplatin was a new drug. And this was in the mid to late 1970s. And MOP was still new. So I would have loved to be a flea on the wall at the bar where Paul Carbone and Vince DeVita designed MOP. No one really still knows. Maybe DeVita remembers, maybe not. But why they designed it day 1 and day 8 every 28 days. At the time, that seemed attractive. It's no longer attractive to me. I wouldn't design a study that way. But I tried then. And this one nice lady, this was before we had any effective antiemetics for cisplatin. Carboplatin wasn't available then. And it took about another decade to prove that it was not inferior to cisplatin. So I tried to give cisplatin day 1 and day 8 with 3 other drugs. And she just wouldn't take it. And because of that, for her, I gave all the intravenous drugs day 1. And we managed to be able to get patients through that, and that became the standard way we gave it, and we ran a phase 3 study in which it turned out that all 4 drugs weren't substantially better, at least in the major outcome, which would be overall survival, than melphalan alone, followed by the other drugs at relapse. But those are the ones I'm thinking of.
Fantastic.
When I said that. The issue then, I think when I asked that question, was someone trying to give lapatinib as preoperative therapy for breast cancer. And lapatinib's a very tough drug with lots of rash, lots of diarrhea, and the doses had to be reduced. And basically what I was asking was, do you do better? Do you get better overall compliance if you start with a tolerable dose rather than an intolerable one? And I think the speaker really didn't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and I think there's been some other recent examples with other targeted therapies where we know that so many patients get dose reduced. So now we start with the tolerable dose and then build up.
So there's one drug on the market. I'm not sure if you want me to mention the name, which I don't think anyone has started with a tolerable dose. So I've written a bunch of articles, which occasionally patients find and call me, you really mean I shouldn't take this drug? And I answer them. And so I had a lady call me from Seattle, 3,000 miles away. She called when everyone had left my office but me. I had my satchel. I was going home. And she said, Dr. Vogl, my doctor wants to give me this drug. And I asked, does your doctor hate you? There's no good evidence that this works worth much at all. And 2 drug companies had abandoned the drug because they thought it was too toxic. An entrepreneur bought it and has managed to convince the FDA that it was worth offering to the doctors. And now all they have to do is send attractive salespeople to their offices, and their patients will get terrible diarrhea for a year for no clear-cut benefit. The study was a catastrophe in its conduct and its analysis.
Yeah.
And the drug company is still pushing the same dose of drug, just with more, in the United States, it's called Imodium, loperamide.
Yeah.
Start it before you give the drug, and the diarrhea takes longer to appear. They haven't convinced me they have a tolerable dose and schedule.
Yeah.
And that's never how I would treat a patient, to make everybody sick and then back off. And this is a treatment for a year to prevent relapse.
I think I know the name of the drug.
I'm sure you do.
So, Steve, what you've managed to do in the last 20 minutes is keep Eva Segalov quiet. So she's been sitting listening, and I don't think I've ever been on this recording equipment before where Eva's been silent for 24 minutes. So, Eva, I really like to throw to you, and is there anything you'd like to ask Dr. Vogl before we let him get on with his day?
Well, thank you, Craig. When I'm listening to someone who's worthwhile, I don't have anything to ask them. So maybe that's the issue. No, Steve, feel free to answer any or none of these questions. But look, our listeners would probably like to know if you'd share with them a little bit more about Steve the man. I can see you've got some ski runs on a mountain slope on the pinboard behind you. What are your hobbies? Would you like to share those with us?
So my interest in skiing has outlived the function in my knees. So I don't downhill ski anymore. Occasionally I do a little bit of cross-country skiing. In Germany, they call that Langlauf. I don't know what they call it in Australia, if there's any snow left after global warming.
Yeah.
I love opera, like theater, like concerts, suffering a bit with COVID. On a good week, I would go to the center of New York City 2 or 3 or 4 times. And if it was a really good week, 2 of them would be the opera.
Wow. Fantastic.
I don't get to do that now. Because I'm getting old, I work slower. So I spend more time doing my charts, writing my notes, thinking about my patients. It's not just writing notes. That's when I think.
What about plans for the future?
I hope I live a little while.
That's a good plan. But do people tend to retire at a certain age?
Yeah, I'm way past that age.
You must be like a federal court judge. You just keep going.
Well, I have no employer, so no one tells me it's our policy that you retire at a certain age. So when I can't do it at a level I think is fair to my patients, I won't do it. I can't work as fast, nor do I especially want to work as fast as I used to. But I like to talk to my patients, and I like to seek advice when I don't know what to do. If I know exactly what to do, I try not to ask because they'll just muddle my thoughts. But there are many times I ask. So Craig asked me if you can be a doctor who does many things. Sure, but it really helps to have very smart, knowledgeable friends. And I ask them often.
Are they only in America or globally?
They're certainly predominantly in America. So occasionally I ask Martine Picard what to do. I correspond with a number of people elsewhere, but they're not usually who I go to.
And tell me about, do you like social media?
What is that? I have no social media presence at all. At the last San Antonio Breast Symposium, which was an in-person symposium, Joe Sperano was one of the, I guess, organizers. I don't know what committee he was on. And he came up to me in the halls and said, "Steve, you're all over Twitter. You ought to go on there." And I said, "What?" I have no idea. I didn't go on.
I think that's probably smart because it made it a lot harder for us to find you. And luckily, I have a sister-in-law in New York who rang your office, and your secretary, who I understand is your wife, very kindly put her through, and you had a chat to her, and here we are. So
now I remember my receptionist. Some lady says her brother is the head of oncology in Australia, and she wants your email. I'm not going to give it to her. Who is this? That's what she told me.
Yeah, that's right.
He's the head of oncology in Australia still. I hope you believe that. Steve, can I ask you if you could take the best things from the past, but the treatments we have now, how would you make an ideal world for the cancer doctor and the cancer patient? Because things back then were not as complicated. Doctors had more autonomy, perhaps, as you've pointed, but we had far less treatment options.
So there is no ideal past. All right. Every situation has its own set of problems. So I remember trying to be an oncologist before the existence of venous access devices. What a pain. What a colossal pain. I remember when I was in practice, the drugs for a doctor at that time were very expensive. A dose of adriamycin was $300. It would take a whole day's work to earn that. So I had the adriamycin pulled up, and I couldn't find the vein. And no one would pay for the adriamycin unless I had given it. Terrible situations. I don't know if any of you remember how the portacath, I don't know if that's what you call them in Australia, these subcutaneous bubbles with a thick membrane that would seal itself, came to be. It's from a bizarre technology of implanted pumps. And they had to figure out a way of loading these pumps percutaneously. So they developed this silastic membrane that would heal itself provided you entered it with a cutting needle. And the portacath is just that membrane leading to a catheter. But that was a real revolution and made it much easier to take care of patients, as were portable infusion pumps. There were no functional portable infusion pumps until about 1987. So I would have to admit a patient for a 4-day infusion. It would take 7 days because the pharmacy wouldn't send up the bags of the fluorouracil, except late. So the patient would be in the hospital 7 days every 3 weeks for a 4-day infusion. And the other thing was growth factors were a huge benefit to the patients and the doctor. Suddenly the hospitals weren't filled with patients with febrile neutropenia. So I embraced the growth factors more than any other physician I know. So I give all but the patients who get very minimally myelosuppressive chemotherapy growth factors in doses appropriate to the degree of myelosuppression. So there was 1 year, I think it was 1985, where I had 750 admissions to one small hospital near where my office. And now, less than a dozen, and most of those for surgical catastrophes or exsanguinating hemorrhages.
Do you have any questions for us before we go?
So how many people listen to your podcast?
Well, we're hoping you'll boost our numbers once they hear you're on.
Are they all physicians?
It's a mixed audience, but we're just new. We've only been running a few months. the intention is to, you remember the old Journal of Clinical Oncology was a cassette and then it was a CD, and you used to put it on in the car or at home and you could listen to a fairly broad update of new studies. So it was sort of modelled on that. We wanted to make it fairly general and enable people to kind of keep up with various new things.
I assume all English speaking, or English is the primary language.
Yes.
So, for your trainees, it's very important to tell them that our enterprise is a noble enterprise, and to emphasize to them that it's not about business, that the businessmen make it about business, but that we are professionals and have to behave that way and resist the undue business influence. That's easy to say when you don't have mouths to feed, but it can sometimes be very difficult. And we're the only ones who can defend the patient against systems where the patient isn't paramount. And things go in cycles. Things will get worse, and they're worse now. They very likely will get much better, although the doctors may not be paid as much.
So some wise words there, Steve. It's been fantastic to get to know you a little bit by email, and it's been fantastic having you on the show. Eva, is there something you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to thank you very much. I wish there were more people like you as role models. It's a tricky world. And as you say, the power is no longer with physicians. We're beholden to many other masters.
So, Steve, we talked a little bit earlier about the design of clinical trials. Would you say that the design has improved or deteriorated over the past decade?
I'm afraid it's deteriorated a lot.
So in what ways has it deteriorated?
So it's deteriorated in terms of using the appropriate endpoints. It's deteriorated in terms of drawing conclusions prematurely based on inadequate data. The statistical designs have gotten more and more bizarre and unreliable. The analysis has gotten less honest. And I'm afraid some of us, like me, wonder whether we can trust anything that comes out of some of these drug company studies now, because they're asking so many questions that they're not telling us about.
So let's break that down a bit. So the first point was you think that some of the studies are showing the wrong endpoints. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So the most glaring example is the ADAURA study. That's a study of adjuvant osimertinib for resected EGFR mutated lung cancer. So we already have 2 studies showing that weaker agents that attack the same mutation, same target, prolong disease-free survival and don't affect survival. So there was never any issue that osimertinib wouldn't prolong disease-free survival. Progression-free survival. It's disease-free survival since they're all resected in the study. The question was whether it prolonged overall survival. And they presented it in ASCO and declared victory. And I suspect that they'll get the FDA to approve it. I don't really care whether it's approved. I just care deeply that we find out whether it prolongs survival or not. At ESMO 2 weeks ago, they showed brain metastasis data, and it substantially reduces the incidence of brain metastases. That may be a reason to give this drug, though it's a very expensive drug, to reduce the absolute number of brain metastases by 10%. Anyway, the 2 trials presented at ESMO about CDK4/6 inhibitors, they were looking at progression-free survival as the endpoint in the first basically 2 years. We don't give these drugs for 2-year differences of 3% in progression-free survival. We give it because we want people to live instead of die.
So that was Palace and Monarchy, I think.
Right. Those are the studies. Then you have Impassion 130 and Impassion 131. Those are breast cancer studies.
Breast cancer studies?
They're studies of atezolizumab given for metastatic triple-negative breast cancer.
Yeah.
And anyway, the endpoint that people talk about and the endpoint they present is progression-free survival, but the only one they really care about is overall survival. But in their statistical plan, they promised they wouldn't look at a survival in subgroups if the overall survival wasn't significant. So, of course, they did it anyway. They didn't claim a p-value, but they got the FDA to approve the drug based on a subgroup analysis they promised not to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
that's at least 5 recent examples of studies.
Yeah, so there's also a new class of patients that never existed before, presented at ESMO. It's the study was Checkmate 577. This new class of patients were patients who got pre-op chemotherapy and radiation for esophageal cancer. And they decided to separate out the patients who, when they had their esophagectomies, had some detectable cancer, either in the primary site or in nodes. Now, as you'd expect, they do worse than ones who have no cancer. Not that the ones who have no cancer do very well. They still do lousy. Most of them die of this disease. Anyway, their endpoint was disease-free survival. So the curves are sort of parallel but separate. So the medians are far apart by 11 months. But at 2 years, it's only about a 10% disease-free survival difference. But that's not the right endpoint. They're going to report on survival. But the presenter claimed that, this is only the second disease where PD-1 antagonists have been useful in adjuvant therapy. And it's interesting. If I had the disease and were treated that way, I would probably want to get the drug, but I don't think it's done.
Yeah, that's right. These are very expensive drugs with potentially life-saving.
They're not only expensive, every once in a while they kill someone.
Yeah.
I've unfortunately killed somebody with one of these drugs on one dose.
Yeah.
I didn't like it.
Yeah. So again, premature data without the survival data. And you mentioned long study durations.
I don't mind hearing the data and being encouraged, but I think they shouldn't declare victory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyhow.
Mission accomplished.
Yep, that's it. Just like in the Gulf War.
Yeah.
And it wasn't at all, if you recall.
So the second point you mentioned was study duration. So again, can you think of some examples of that recently where the wrong study durations?
The primary endpoint, these issues all interconnect, but the primary endpoint for Monarch E and for Pallas, the 2 adjuvant CDK4/6 inhibitor studies that were presented at ESMO, was invasive disease-free survival, and they looked also at distant recurrence-free survival. These were very high-risk breast cancer patients who were all ER positive. The bulk of them had more than 4 positive nodes. So most of their events were metastatic events. But they looked very early. And one of the 2 studies was closed with a median follow-up of less than 2 years. When did we ever do that for an adjuvant study?
Yeah.
Breast cancer, even hormone receptor positive breast cancer, is heterogeneous, probably in ways we can't imagine. And organizing a study of 6,000 women and declaring victory or failure, both are, I think, are premature. Now, it's a drug company. Their primary obligation is to the stockholders to make money. And I guess they thought if they had to wait too long, they would get a positive study for a drug no longer on patent that makes no money. I don't know what went into closing the study, but they closed it for futility very early in the follow-up. It's part of what happens when all the research is done by drug companies.
Yeah. So you also talked about statistical plan. Can you give us an example of where you think that's involved? I think that's where there is an obvious ability to perhaps influence results or manipulate results.
So I was thinking about this yesterday, and I wonder whether this didn't start from the first ipilimumab study. Ipilimumab? I can't say that word. In melanoma. Bristol Myers didn't design the study. Some little company did. And it was a study where ipilimumab did better than the other 2 groups in the study. But one was a vaccine, ganglioside vaccine, and the other one was a ganglioside vaccine plus IPI. There was no control group that anyone knew how it did. And this got approved. Turned out IPI was a good drug. But it took another year and a half to hear a study with a real control group, which was chemotherapy versus chemotherapy plus IPI. For all we know, the ganglioside vaccine made things worse. Not IPI made things better. I remember sitting there seething. It was one of these plenary sessions at ASCO where they allowed no questions. So I couldn't get up and give them a hard time. What's your control group? this ganglioside vaccine had been given to a very selected and somewhat strange group of patients at the National Cancer Institute. It had never been done in a formal big adjuvant trial. Anyway, the Bristol Myers after that has been designing complicated studies, sometimes with 3 arms and not telling us what happened in the other arm, not telling us what questions they planned on asking, and creating questions after the data are in. They did that in a study called Checkmate 227 and published. They used a new way of sorting the data to a mutational burden to make their immunotherapies look more effective.
And we often hear no results from certain arms, which is always a bit worrying.
What it means, those arms were put in there for a reason. It cost the drug company a lot of money to recruit the patients for these arms they're not talking about. So the reason we're not hearing about them was because if we hear about them, they won't make so much money. I mean, those data are in. I think only if we express outrage again and again will this stop.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the drug companies have learned that they can get away with trying to get a broader indication, and then if that doesn't work, start doing subgroups. And so they make these very complicated allocations of alpha, of how positive the study has to be. What's the likelihood that it's chance alone? And I remember the days when a study asked a question and it either excluded chance or it didn't exclude chance. Very simple. You knew what you were looking at. They asked one question. Now they're asking a question, does the immunotherapy work in everybody? Does it work in people with no PD-L1 expression, with a little, with a moderate amount, or a lot? So when you ask that many questions, you're going to find a positive result in some group and a negative result in some other by chance alone. The more question you ask, the more likely you are to get a false result, both positive and negative.
Yeah.
They're getting away with it.
So this comes down to some honesty. You mentioned honesty of analysis.
Well, if they don't tell us how some of the patients did, and they lump patient groups, so if there's one group that does better, the ones with high PD-L1 expression, you tend to hear the ones with no PD-L1 expression and the ones with greater than 50% or greater than 1%. They don't want to show us the 1 to 50 because there may be no benefit. Sometimes they eventually reveal it. There was a lung cancer study in which they revealed it. But in some of the studies, it just wasn't mentioned. And those are a significant number of patients, 200 in each arm.
Yeah. Do you have any specific examples of that, Stephen?
Yes, I do. Now, there was a study presented with chemoimmunotherapy in gastro and esophageal cancer. And never did they mention the group with a less than 1% that were in the study. They showed us more than 1%, more than 50%, or whatever the number was. I'm sorry, I can't remember the numbers right now. But that's been done several times in these studies. So their hope is that they'll get a blanket approval and then they can sell more drug, even in subgroups in which in their study it didn't work. So It's an issue whether if your primary endpoint is some endpoint in the entire group, improved survival, delayed relapse, should you not give the drug to subgroups that didn't benefit? Well, there'll always be subgroups that don't benefit, and I'm not sure that that's right, but they should at least show the data.
So it sounds like you're not very trustful.
Why should I be? There's money here. Where there's money involved, you should always be skeptical.
Can you think of any studies where it's been done right?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd ask that. There was a study presented on postoperative radiation to the mediastinum in lung cancer patients whose mediastinal involved nodes had been resected. It was a very difficult study to do. There were old data where old techniques of radiation were used, where at least in stage 3, it didn't hurt people. In earlier stages, it did because radiation has obvious toxicities. So now is a study of about 700 patients done all over Europe, looking at resected mediastinal nodes, 40% of which had not been suspected preoperatively. So when the surgeon takes out a lobe, he takes out a bunch of nodes, even if they were PET negative. And the patients with unexpected nodal metastases are the ones who do best, as you'd expect. and they randomized them to radiation or not. And the radiation worked. What did it do? It substantially reduced mediastinal recurrence. They haven't told us how they looked for mediastinal recurrence. So it's a big issue with patterns of failure studies in radiation, because if you don't look very carefully, you don't know. But anyway, that's what they presented. But the survival was no better. Maybe there was a tiny difference, but it wasn't clinically, biologically, or statistically significant. So you can probably spare some of the people who would otherwise be cured the risks of the radiation. There were deaths from coronary disease and deaths from lung disease, and there were some deaths that were sudden, where no one really knew what it was, but presumably it was cardiac. That's a very important study.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's been discussion about that since then. Some institutions in Australia were routinely giving port and others were not. And so now the feeling is that it's probably unnecessary. So, yeah, it has been an influential study. So, but was that a company-sponsored study? Is that the difference?
No, this was an academic study. Obviously, the money is in giving the radiation. So if there were a company that had a lot of radiation machines and wanted to give radiation to these patients, maybe they would sponsor the study. But companies are basically leery of sponsoring studies where the likelihood of success is low. So they like to find a control group that's guaranteed not to work. I can tell you lots of studies like that. Chlorambucil in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Give it with some antibody, it never works. And compare your new drug to chlorambucil with an antibody. Bingo, everything works.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic, Dr. Vogl. You clearly are a very passionate, deep thinker about these issues. I think a lot of medical oncologists probably don't think as much, and they just accept what the study findings are and accept what the informed speaker and what do we call them, key opinion leader says. But I think we all need to think very carefully about all of these issues and make sure that we're doing the right thing by our patients and by our societies, by, not just going along with expensive new drugs that really don't have a survival impact. So all praise to you for your insights into this important issue.
Thank you. In Australia, does the nation negotiate drug prices?
They do. So we are lucky we have a pretty good system. So a drug's approved for use from a safety and efficacy point of view, and then there's a price negotiation with the government.
Yeah, so in the United States, we have the best government money can buy, and the drug companies bought it.
Yeah. So our drugs can't be approved unless they're shown to be cost effective. So that's one of the main endpoints, is not only that survival benefit, but a cost of efficacy value has to be demonstrated. So we're pretty lucky. So we don't often get drugs to the market as quickly as the US, but perhaps there's a good reason for that. Unless the price is right, then the drugs won't make it. So it's this whole issue about the design of studies and the influence of companies we all need to be mindful of. So thanks again for coming on the Oncology Journal podcast and talking about this. We look forward to having you on again soon, hopefully post San Antonio.
Fantastic discussion. Thank you very, very much.
So thanks again, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
So I think the proper greeting is good day.
G'day.
G'day.
Thanks, mate.
Bye.
You have a good day. Thanks, mate. Bye.
Bye.
Vogl, New York.
You've been listening to the Oncology Podcast. If you enjoyed today's edition and would like to subscribe, head over to our website, oncologynews.com.au, and sign up to our newsletter. Thanks for listening.